Hello everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon on today's webinar. I'm Amber from the team here at NQA and I'm happy to introduce to you the second part of our 4-part webinar series with our associate partners Auditel. This series breaks down the journey to achieving carbon neutrality aligned to the standard PAS 2060, and today we're focusing on carbon management plans. I'm pleased to welcome Carbon Solutions Specialist David McDonald, who will be presenting on step 2 of the journey, which is titled Designing an Effective Carbon Management Plan. The session will run for approximately 45 minutes and there will be time at the end for a Q&A. So if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so by going into the chat box available and we'll address as many as we can at the end. There will be a recording of the webinar and we'll be circulating this after the session along with a link to request the slides. It's just worth pointing out that if anyone had signed up for the part 1 of the series, then you'll have each part as it happens sent to you automatically as well. So I'll now pass you over to David and I hope you all enjoy. Thanks very much, David.
Thank you, Amber. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this next 45 minutes, which is something of a whistle-stop tour of carbon reduction planning. I suspect, well, this is the second, as you said, Amber, the second of 4 webinars that we're working through with NQA, and I hope that some of you will be able to join the remainder of this series. I do have a fairly ambitious scope of coverage today, so I'm going to try very hard not to wander too much off topic. Moving forward, so my name, as Amber said, is David McDonald. I'm trained management accountant, so I guess I'm trained in navigational accounting rather than, sometimes you see the analogy of the guy rowing the boat up the river like that, you know, the guy who's doing the rowing. That's not me, that's the financial accountant, because he's looking back, he's measuring where he's come from. Navigational accounting is rather more forward-looking, so that is me. And just to continue the theme of navigation, here we have a lovely picture of a compass. And I just wanted to cover where is it we're going to be going with our presentation this afternoon. And of course, any journey starts with an origin and a destination. We're going to talk about both of those. We're going to then start, I'm going to spend some time on strategic fundamentals, just to, I suppose, provide a little bit of context. You know, and these strategic fundamentals are really about, it doesn't have to be climate change, it doesn't have to be carbon management. It's just a practice in corporate governance around looking more widely at the market, identifying risks and opportunities for your business, and addressing the sustainability of your business in that environment, both commercial and environmental sustainability. I'm then going to spend a few minutes on a slide which will look at the prescribed plan contents. So PAS 2060 does set out fairly succinctly in sections 7 and 8 what needs to be part of your carbon reduction plan. I then intend to spend a little bit of time talking about business cases. So going back to my accounting roots, I suppose, is how best to convey those business cases in an impactful and hopefully a successful way. You will probably be having to pilot carbon reduction plans through a corporate board at some point. So I aim to help you come away with some information and knowledge that will arm you for that engagement. And then critically important in my view is impact measurement. Unless you set yourself up to prove the point and prove the impact of your intervention, then you're setting yourself up to fail, frankly. You'll not be able to convince people that you've done a good job. So that's critically important. So we'll touch on that at the back end of the presentation. So that said, carbon management is most definitely a journey. It's not something that organizations are going to be dealing with overnight, or even in the next sort of tactical planning time frame, the next 5-year plan or 3-year plan in your business. It's a long way, you know, and very often the best route from A to B is not going to be in a straight line. As anybody who's a Strava cyclist will tell you, sometimes the easiest route is round the mountain and not straight over the top. So with that said, I'm going to launch into a little bit of a reprise, actually. So those of you who attended the presentation last Friday by my colleagues on carbon footprinting will recognize this slide. So essentially where we are at the moment is that you've gone through the first step, which is defining and measuring that carbon footprint. That's your business as usual, if you like. We're going to be discussing this afternoon the second step in that process, which is to do with reduction planning, carbon reduction planning. And then I'm not going to dwell any further really on this one, because step 3, hopefully you will be able to tune in for, which is to discuss carbon offsets with one of my colleagues, Mark Miller, next week. So hopefully you'll be able to tune in and join the rest of those webinars. Origins then. So starting with your carbon footprint, and again, those who were on the call on Friday will recognise this as one of the slides in that deck. So this is setting out a carbon footprint for an organisation, which, as you can see down the left-hand side, consists of scope 1 and scope 2, and a few elements of scope 3, incorporating waste and business travel, etc. So really, this is setting out the organisation's business as usual, where it's starting from. This is your origin. The fact is that there have been other bits of legislation, other things that businesses have been engaged in over the years, which kind of compel them to measure carbon emissions. So I'm thinking here principally of two kind of fiscal measures, so driven by regulations. The first is ESOS, which is the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. And it's designed to measure or identify and measure opportunities for energy efficiency. We're now into the third phase of ESOS reporting. So this is an obligatory piece of reporting which organisations of a certain size or over a certain size are obliged to carry out. So whilst the exercise itself did, I've seen many of these reports. They do carry on the opportunity spotting. They do bring forward opportunities to reduce energy consumption. What is probably fair to say, though, is that not many, even though we're now into measuring the third phase of ESOS, my lead assessor colleagues will tell me that they've gone through ESOS 1, they've made recommendations, they come to do ESOS 2, those same recommendations are repeated. Nothing has happened in between times. Not quite sure why that's happening, because it's, well, I guess we'd speculate and say, it's generally led by a third party. Generally, these are external lead assessors, and so perhaps there's little buy-in from the organisations themselves, and they've considered it simply to be a compliance measure. And then along the same veins, we have SECR, which is Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting. Again, it's another mandatory piece of reporting for larger organisations. It requires them to pull together a fairly brief carbon report covering scope 1, scope 2 emissions, and just a small subset of scope 3 emissions to do with travel. That report needs to be incorporated in an annual account, an annual report. It's not currently in the financial reporting for the organisation, it's in the director's report. And that means that it's not subject to an audit in the same way as a financial report might be. However, it is producing a whole series of organisational reports around carbon. It's raising the profile of carbon. However, it is true to say that it too doesn't oblige the organisation to do anything about it. So similar to ESOS 1, ESOS 1 is actually identifying opportunities to make reduction measures at things that will make financial sense and pay back quickly. Not a lot happening. SECR, in the same vein, it's a piece of mandatory reporting, but it's not requiring organisations to actually do anything with that output. You might argue that it's simply encouraging behaviour change in companies by putting peer pressure on them, and the fact is they don't want to disclose this year that they've got the same carbon intensity as they had the year before, or perhaps even greater. So both have been compliance driven, both are relatively low impact, I would say. And it's going to be interesting to see, the current wave of interest in carbon accounting, carbon reporting, net zero, carbon neutrality, etc. There is certainly a bit more of a movement towards this, and the trick will be to make sure the communication is done correctly in order to deliver the success. So here we are looking at the origin of our carbon management journey. So what of the destination? This gentleman is a picture of Chris Skidmore, and in June 2019, as really it's the last really important thing that Theresa May did before leaving government was that she signed the UK up to a legal obligation to reach net zero by 2050. So he's the man that actually put the ink on the paperwork. Prior to this target, the target was expressed as an 80% reduction from 1990 levels. I much prefer the net zero by 2050 level. It's by 2050, it's much clearer, and it's actually a bit more ambitious. The government takes its advice in this area on this topic from the Climate Change Committee. So this is kind of an independent or semi-independent group of experts, which is providing reports for government to consider in terms of policy making. So I often get asked the question, so what's legal about it? What is it that is, what is the legal impact of this undertaking that the UK has entered into as a nation state, net zero by 2050? And the fact of the matter is that, that's untested. Would a poor third world developing country be able to take the UK to court because it's not met its legal obligations? That's not clear. What is clear, however, is that the government has essentially set itself a framework by which its own decision making can be held to account. And so here I would give you the example of the government's decision to allow the expansion of Heathrow Airport. Now that is something which the Court of Appeal said, I'm sorry, you can't do that because it's in contravention to your legal undertakings. That expansion is unlawful because it doesn't take those climate commitments into account. So that's just one example of where I suppose the balance of evidence must be in favour of the climate change commitments the UK government has made. I hesitate to use the phrase Partygate, but that was an example of the government setting some regulations and then trying not to follow them by allowing the Heathrow expansion to go ahead. So again, it's kind of checks and balances on government and its own decision-making infrastructure. So that's Chris Skidmore, a few things to thank him for. We touched on the Climate Change Committee. And it's important, I think, that we do recognise that there is a body of experts that sit behind the way that government policy is developed. Thank goodness we're not relying on the politicians to do all of this work. It's complicated, it's time consuming, it's a lot of detail, there's lots of feed into it. And I think you have to have a significant attention span to get anywhere with it. So, as I say, I'm rather pleased that it's not the politicians that are leading the charge on this. It was set up to advise the UK government on its climate policy. One of the most recent results of that was the publication of the new net zero strategy last year, and which talks about how the UK government plans to deliver its net zero commitments by 2050. And here, just looking at this chart, I pulled this one out because I think it's quite, it tells a story in itself. The Climate Change Committee has identified that timescales are critical. So rather than saying to organisations and to human beings generally, don't worry, you've got until 2050 to solve this problem, chill out. This is saying to us that actually we need to put in intermediate staging posts. We need to set 5-year carbon budgets, tranches of progress that we can measure. And then when we start falling behind, or if we start falling behind those particular targets, we've got some time to respond. So as you can see there, we're at the moment, we're well into the third carbon budget period. The pink bars on the chart illustrate that actually thus far we've been doing reasonably well in staying within the carbon budget limits that the Committee on Climate Change has set out. I think it's going to get more challenging as time goes on, because naturally some of the things at the beginning of the programme are the easiest things to address, so the low-hanging fruit, as it were. Those have been dealt with. We have made some great progress in things like decarbonising the electricity grid here in the UK. We've made significant progress against that. And the spin-off of that investment will continue to help decarbonising as we go forward. When we start to think about how we decarbonise heat and transport, it's all about electrifying both of those things. So those sectors will look at decarbonising by electrifying heat and electrifying transport. The number of EVs on our roads continues to grow at a significant rate now. So here we are, we're into the third carbon budget period. My view is that it will become increasingly difficult to meet those carbon budgets going forward. And then we've got recent reports about, Today programme this morning. You could be alarmed when you listen to some of these things coming forward. We're looking at a 1.5 degree global average temperature rise, 50-50 chance in the next 5 or 6 years, as a one-off. But we're very much on this path at the moment. Until we start to operate at scale and to respond significantly in a short period of time, we will start to be in a runaway situation. We'll start to get feedback loops. So it's really, really important that we start moving on this now. The risk that the Climate Change Committee highlights is that of policy gap. So our government and successive governments are very keen on sloganeering. They're very keen on making announcements, and this was highly prevalent. If you recall, at COP26 in Glasgow last November, there was lots of slogans going around from our government and other governments signing on to commitments, and then actually we're left with a significant policy gap. The policy making infrastructure moves quite slowly. There's lots of consultation to go on, etc. So in a situation where we need to move quickly on this, there is a real risk that policy gap exists. Gradually, we're closing that policy gap. So really, whether or not we like it or agree with it, the destination has been set for us. We've signed up to a national target, and companies just need to get in line with that. It's not optional anymore. In the words of the Climate Change Committee, it is existential. So carbon reduction planning, it is a long way to go. I mean, I would say that no doubt the destination that we've been set is ambitious, it's challenging. Is it too far? That remains to be seen. It's most definitely challenging. I often get feedback or pushback that the UK itself only represents 1% of total global emissions, and people tell me that China's building coal-fired power stations at the rate of 1 a week. All of that is true, but then you're looking at the responsibility and the ethical aspect of the UK. It was most definitely the country that led the Industrial Revolution. And yes, although UK territorial emissions may only be 1% of the global total, the UK is by far having a greater impact because of its influence in overseas trade and production. The UK has offshored a lot of its manufacturing industries to cheaper and, one would argue, less well-regulated jurisdictions. So, this WTO, World Trade Organization, way of trading is, it's not doing anything at the moment to put a cap on carbon emissions if you're in these kind of legislatures. So offshoring carbon is a bit of an issue. I want to throw up another slide. Yes, carbon reduction planning, it is a long way and it's quite challenging. I would argue we have a responsibility. This question about if not now, when. Time is running out. Action is required. It's required now. I've spent a lot of time in recent months working with schools, and very often, we have young people as part of our carbon discovery programs, and we have a conversation as part of that about the word eco, which is very often seen as a positive thing. It's good for the environment. It's sustainable. It's green. It's all eco. It's all good. And then the word anxiety comes along, and when you combine those two things, you get your eco-anxiety, and it's most definitely something which is prevalent in the language and the concerns of young people particularly. But I would say that not just young people. We were joined at a fairly recent discovery meeting by, we'll call him Will. He was a design and technology teacher, and he was a card-carrying member of a rebellion group, which will remain nameless, but a direct action group. And Will was about 6'4". He had the hands the size of a silverback gorilla. He crushed my hands in handshake at the beginning of the meeting, and he then sat in the conversation almost like the conscience on our shoulder all the way through this thing. So I would say there's a lot of energy in a conversation like that, in a discovery session like that. And it's important to be able to harness that in a positive way. So it's to take the anxiety feeling that young people have, and that anxiety is really born from the fact that they do feel a little bit powerless in the conversation. they feel as if, they're going to be living that future, they're going to be dealing with those issues. But right now, they feel as if they're they feel as if they're ignored. They don't feel as if they have a voice. So it's really important to be able to give them a voice and to support them in expressing that. So turning that energy into something which is positive and will lead to solutions is really important. The other thing that has been quite positive in the schools environment is that a couple of weeks ago, the DFE, the Department for Education, issued a brand new GCSE, the first one for decades, and that GCSE is called Natural History, and it pulls together a lot of the things which this whole topic requires. This broader communication of carbon literacy, climate change, etc. It's going to be there as an optional subject for school children to choose to follow. I look forward to seeing that being taken up with enthusiasm in a few years' time when it comes into the curriculum. I think it's scheduled for 2025. So the point of this slide really, isn't, well, it is to prick your conscience. It's to say that we owe a duty of care to the young people that are going through school now and to future generations. So yes, it's tricky, but we have that obligation. I'm going to move on now and just spend a few minutes on what I've titled strategic fundamentals. Who remembers Woolworths, eh? So change is a constant feature of our business environment here in the UK. It's partly driven by the business model, so free enterprise and capitalism and all of that stuff. It's a fairly cutthroat environment. I remember looking back at a report, this was a few years ago now, but there was a bit of work done which tracked the FTSE index. FTSE 100 index was launched in 1984, comprising 100 organisations, obviously. By 2017, only 28 of those original 100 constituents were still in the index. So that just gives you an idea of the churn involved in what we're dealing with at a strategic level or company level. Some of the bellwethers, even the most familiar names, have disappeared from our high streets in the meantime. So we're living in a period really of continual corporate change, never mind the things that we've had to deal with in the last couple of years. So the last 2 years, we've seen some really stark external change examples. Of course, I'm talking about COVID-19 as the first of those. So something which came right out of left field. I would argue that there's probably a very, very small percentage of organisations that had incorporated global pandemics into their strategic planning exercises every year. But there it was, it was something that was sudden, it was mandatory, it affected every single business and every consumer of goods and services in the world, really. So, it's something which, is a great example of having change forced upon you. And change we did, organisations did get to grips with it. They did come up with new ways of working. So those that could, those that had the resilience to do it, adjusted. Unfortunately, lots of businesses, particularly in hospitality, simply didn't have the balance sheet, didn't have the resources, didn't have the resilience to survive. And they've gone. They've become part of our history. And then, of course, the other thing that's happened in more recent months is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's had a hugely significant impact on the European energy complex, particularly, but also globally from a sort of geopolitical sense. From an energy point of view, we have seen clients that work with us and who were forced to go to renewal on energy supply contracts in the months of sort of February through March, April. They're paying 450, maybe 500% more for the energy than they were when they last signed a contract for supplies. So a really significant impact. And again, when you're talking about corporate planning, you're talking about cycles of maybe 3 to 5 years and an annual budget for the following year. Highly unlikely that those businesses would have factored in those kind of increases to their corporate planning. So those are two things that kind of came out of left field. Some really stark and interesting examples affecting different organizations in different ways. Now compare that with climate change. Climate change is one of those things where we've got tens of thousands of scientists telling us this is happening to us. Okay, but it's slowly happening. It's kind of evolving. Many organizations are not seeing the impact right now, but that doesn't mean it's not happening, that it's going on. As we have a global supply chain, the impacts are going to start to be felt fairly quickly from here on in. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, his view was that businesses must align themselves and set themselves up in a sustainable fashion they must start to look at, well, how do we solve the problems of our society? And only then can they earn the right to stick around. His view is that those businesses that don't move, those traditional extractive industries or process industries that cannot evolve, will not be here. I just wanted to touch on a very quick story about Sumitomo. Sumitomo is a Japanese investment fund. Japanese investment fund that invested very wisely in a coal-fired power station in Western Australia. And then in 2019, just before the pandemic, actually, they made an announcement that they were going to write off $1 billion investment in that coal plant. They shut it down. Now, as somebody who has worked in major utility companies before, my job used to be putting investment proposals together for new power stations, so combined cycle gas power stations, hydro repowering, wind farms, things like that. Now, a coal-fired power station is a huge infrastructure asset. You make that investment, much like hydro, you think it's going to be there operating for 50 or 60 years, making you money. It very quickly became what we would call a stranded asset. Sumitomo made the decision to write off £1 billion. So that was a virtually new power station. It was 10 years old. So very, very young in the terms of utility power stations. So stranded assets, something which, again, at the strategic level, organizations really need to think about. And the question really is, can growth and green go together in the same sentence? So thinking again more fundamentally about the strategic environment that we're living in, is it realistic to continue with the continuous growth model? Countries measure their success in terms of GDP, gross domestic product. Most forecasts for most organizations are measured in profit terms, cash terms. Shareholder growth, pension growth, all of it is pointing towards a continual growth. And if you find yourself sitting in a fishbowl called planet Earth with a finite limit on resources, there are limits to that growth. Is it realistic to expect that we continue measuring our growth in the same way going forward? I've come to the conclusion, and I hope that many of you will too, that it's simply not realistic, and that we do have to rethink the whole fabric of our economic society and think about moving in a more circular fashion. Businesses then, really at a strategic level, must think about planning carefully and evolving now to try and avoid that cliff edge, to avoid becoming the Woolworths of the high street in that image. So dropping down a level, so dropping from that strategic level to what I would call tactical planning. And this kind of brings us into the sort of 3 to 5 year timeframes for corporate decision making. And I thought that it was really interesting last year. We had a Cabinet Office published, and some of you may have heard this at last week's presentation. The Cabinet Office published what's called PPN 0621. And that really compels any organisation that has a desire to work or to gain contracts, win contracts in the public sector. If you want to do that, you have to complete a template. That template needs to have a commitment towards carbon reduction and carbon neutrality. And it also has to set out some of the plans or measures that you will follow as an organisation to deliver that. So that's an interesting impact. We've seen there must be tens of thousands of them out there now, organisations that have completed those templates. Some organisations have done just that. They've just completed the template, filled in the boxes, and that's it. Other organisations have taken a more studied approach to it, and they've incorporated signposting, and they've embellished or they've added value to those plans by pointing out some of the other things that they're already doing in this area. So I have just, for the purposes of illustration this afternoon, I've just picked out a few of those which I thought were reasonably notable. The first of which is the Energy Savings Trust, or Energy Saving Trust. Now, these guys have obviously been around energy savings for decades, many years. You'd have expected them to be all over this topic. But what I found was quite interesting is that in the kind of preamble and the arguments around setting their baseline date, where they start measuring their carbon footprint, they've chosen 2020-21. Now, of course, that's the year that we had COVID. That was the big impact of COVID-19 and business lockdowns and all the rest of it. But what they're arguing is that actually that was the most complete emissions data set that they had. Surprise, surprise, this is the Energy Savings Trust. they did not have a full emissions data set for the prior year, 1920, which would have been more representative of business rhythm, if you like, a more normal year. But then interestingly, what they did say was that they are prioritising starting that journey now because they recognise that progress towards net zero is so urgent. They feel they can't afford to wait another year for another more representative year to set their baseline. They're getting on with it now. They also wanted to, in a sense, they also wanted to capitalise on the fact that a lot of the staff were returning to business for the first time after COVID-19. COVID-19 served as a catalyzer, a catalyst for lots of different business practices and different ways of working, particularly around what we're doing right now, remote working. Can that be effective? Hopefully it can. And other things which they can then implement to help decarbonise their operations. So I found that was quite interesting as a kind of a preamble to the work that they are starting, and more importantly, their starting point. What is it they specifically talked about? They said that they were aiming for net zero by 2050. Now that makes a lot of sense. Don't say 2060 because that's non-compliant. But more importantly, what they have done is they've introduced a 2030 staging post. So following the kind of example of the Committee on Climate Change, or the Climate Change Committee, they recognise the need for an intermediate goal to motivate action today. They do include key Scope 3 sources, so they're looking more widely than their direct emissions, which is good. One or two specific examples, they talked about moving their IT infrastructure onto the cloud using Microsoft Azure, cloud services provider, arguing that it gave them more flexibility and control over their carbon footprint for all their IT services. They also recognise that it's important to focus on how you manage things. So they're looking at certification for ISO 14001 and 50001 series certifications. They recognise the importance of continual or regular communication about progress, about how you measure things, both with internal and external stakeholders. And they obviously clearly have senior leadership support in the work that they're doing. So that's the Energy Savings Trust. They also had, as part of their submission, it might be worth you having a look at it, we don't have the time today, but some really interesting ways in which they've engaged their workforce by introducing different theme days or activity days as part of their communication planning. So quite interesting. Next, I'm going to move on to Ernst Young. Ernst Young, as you'll know, are one of the leading global management consultancy firms. Thousands of staff, tens of thousands of staff globally. And it's a giant in terms of emissions as well. 1.35 million tons of CO2 equivalent reported in their last year. You'd think they'd know what they were talking about, wouldn't you? So their ambition is expressed in this way: is to be carbon negative in calendar year 2021 and net zero by 2025. Now, as a practitioner in this area, as somebody who deals with this from time to time, that seems hugely ambitious to me. I'm also scratching my head a bit about, well, what does carbon negative mean? So carbon negative, I first came across this when Microsoft launched their carbon negative strategy back in 2019. They very quickly got hold of, the marketing team very quickly got hold of it and said you can't market something with the word negative in it. So they changed it pretty rapidly to climate positive. But it's just another example of the confusing array of terminology that gets wielded in this area. I don't know what carbon negative means. I'm going to have to go and find out. So I can't read this report from E&Y and understand exactly what they're trying to say to me. So it's an interesting example of making it more difficult to understand rather than being clear about it. The other interesting thing was that they're still recruiting to the delivery team and that their work starts in 2022. I know that Ernst Young have been advising clients on this for years. So it's time to start. It's a bit of the cobbler's shoes, I suspect, here. They've probably done bits of it. I'm sure they've done bits of it. But they obviously recognise there is a capacity shortfall within their organisation to do this job well. And that's a theme that I would encourage you to think about in your own businesses and your own organisations. It does need to be well resourced. So what are they actually thinking of doing? Well, it's a global consultancy services firm. Most of their carbon footprint is to do with getting staff from A to B and travel. So naturally, they're trying to reduce travel. They're going to then reduce office electricity use, and then for any that remains, they're going to purchase green tariff energy. So far, so predictable. What else are they going to do? They're going to put their suppliers under a huge amount of pressure. So it's clear that this is being pushed up the supply chain fairly aggressively. Ernst Young are not the only ones. If you look at the UK grocery multiples, for example, some of them have carbon footprints where the scope 3 element comprises probably 90% plus, maybe 95% of their total carbon emissions footprint. The only tools they have really to effectively reduce that carbon footprint is by working carefully and consistently with their supply chain. So that's a consistent theme in all of these things. And then finally, we're going to turn to look at Babcock, big engineering concern. They've set a target looking at scope 1 and 2 by 2040, and then also incorporating scope 3 by 2050. The thing that struck me about that was the iceberg on the right-hand side. They've taken 18 years to incorporate scope 1 and 2, get to net zero. That's a bit above the water, and then they've given themselves a 10-year task to get to scope 3 net zero by 2050. So it seems a little bit of a hiatus to me. Let's get on with it, guys. Let's get that scope 3 target brought forward a few years. What they're doing is they're developing that internal carbon footprint capability. Again, it's capacity building inside the organisation. They recognise that as being really important. They've got disclosure stuff to do. They've got projects they need to carry out. They've also got product footprinting they need to do. So they've got a lot to get on with. They too are considering engaging their supply chain, and they're getting on with that as well. They recognise the importance of management systems, so carefully considering how they measure and manage the activities on their sites. And then specifically, they're thinking about their ULEV fleets. In other words, any vehicles that they're operating will move towards ultra-low emission vehicle status. So whether that's replacement fuels for diesel stuff or hybrid electric or pure electric vehicles. So those were just a few examples that I picked out. There are hundreds and in fact thousands of them out there. You just have to Google it. These are some of the more interesting ones that I thought would help illustrate the point today about planning. In terms of planning, what is it that PAS 2060 requires us to do? If you're going down the PAS 2060 route, looking at carbon neutrality, there is certain prescribed content. It starts with that same commitment that you see under PPN 0621. The organisation must make a public statement of commitment to carbon neutrality. You must then state the targets and the timeframes by which you will be meeting them, and then setting out the planned means. What activities will you be bringing forward to achieve those targets? As I say, those very specific requirements in PAS 2060 are set out in section 7.8 of the document. Importantly, you've got to be using the same factors and the same measurements from year to year. You must be consistent, in other words. And the idea is to make sure that you express a real reduction in your carbon emissions using the same measurement techniques, etc. If you change those measurement techniques, if perhaps you come up with a better and more accurate way of measuring stuff, you need to go back and restate the comparative from the year before, much like you would do in an accounting sense for a business that has changed the shape of the business or the organisation itself. And then finally, you've got to also state your offset strategy, which we'll cover in more detail next time. So that's kind of the prescribed content of that plan. I wanted to talk in a little bit more detail now about what sort of options are available to organisations to make those reductions in reality. We've got a chart here. You may have seen this before. There's a split in terms of coloured blobs between behavioural change, capital investments, and procurement options. Some of these overlap, and we're going to be talking a bit of detail about one or two of these. We're going to spend some time on solar PV, as it is pretty much of the moment. It's a ubiquitous opportunity. It covers all sectors generally. So what you've got here is ease of implementation across the x-axis at the bottom, and then the impact on CO2 on the y-axis going vertically. It's not empirical by any means, but it's just to give you an idea that some of these things will be more difficult to implement than others, and some will have a higher impact on your business. It's very sector specific, and it depends on where your business is with its starting point. So procurement examples, things like 100% renewable electricity, zero waste to landfill. You can influence your carbon emissions footprint by influencing your supply chain and your choice of how you procure things. The dark blue blobs are about behavioural change, things like flexible working, sharing education, carbon literacy, etc. with the workforce, making sure that induction procedures are covering the key topics around carbon emissions, etc. as well. So these are good examples of how you expect behaviours to change inside your organisation to try and help deliver the things that you need to deliver. And then finally, the capital investment ones. I'm going to go into a bit more detail now on how you pull together a business case for something like solar PV. It is ubiquitous, even at these latitudes, it pays back pretty well. What we've seen in recent years is a significant drop in the installed cost of the equipment, and the projects are cheaper to buy. And at the same time, we've seen the imported cost of energy for businesses skyrocket. It's gone up significantly. So the business case, that comes together to make a great deal of sense from a business point of view, even before you add in the value of carbon offsetting inside an organisation. So I can still, as an accountant, have a conversation with an FD on things like internal rates of return and payback. The fundamentals of solar PV and making it work are really represented in this chart here. What you're looking at is in the red area at the background, you're looking at the site load. In the yellow area, you're looking at what the PV array is going to generate for you, and the green line is showing you what you're going to consume on site. The key thing is sizing it correctly so you're absorbing as much of that energy on your site as possible. And that's because of the differential between the exported value of energy and the imported cost of energy. Imported cost at maybe 30 pence per kilowatt hour, and the exported value at between 6 and 10 pence per kilowatt hour. So it makes sense to try and keep it on the roof and use it under the roof. It's also very important in more recent months to have seen the volatility in the energy markets to think about the value of having a physical hedge, that is an asset behind the meter that does well for you and offsets your exposure to that external market. I'm skipping through these slides rather quickly now because we're running out of time. This is just an example. It's a fairly recent scheme that we've looked at. It uses gearing. In other words, it's borrowed a little bit of debt. Debt is still at historically low levels here, even following the last and most recent rise to 1% on the base rate. It's still very cheap. So you're able to, if you use some debt, some corporate credit lines, you're able to gear up the REITs that you have around capital investments. We're actually at the moment able to drive a typical project rate of return at 30% post-tax nominal. That's an IRR, and an equity IRR. In other words, if you're putting a part of your own equity, your own resources, and borrowing some cheap debt, your equity returns are pushing 50% for a solar PV scheme at the moment, assuming it's well sized and it's well designed. The message there really is that being good in a carbon sense doesn't mean you have to. It's not just a cost to business that can actually pay back quite significantly in the long term. You need to set yourself up when you're starting to think about the initiatives that you're following to set yourselves up to measure and be empirical about the impacts that you're having. The good news is that today it's much more possible with the development of technology. It's much easier to start measuring the impact of what you're doing by implementing sub-metering systems and implementing BMS, building management systems, or energy management systems. The range and the array of different ways in which you can measure the impact is much more significant than it once was. But think about it, plan for it, and importantly, if you're carrying out a program of different interventions at the same time, it's important to think about the way the effect of those and how they layer on each other. Because if you think about, as part of some of the work that I've done fairly recently, is a program of work where we're implementing some heating controls in some student bedrooms, and at the same time we're implementing a behavioural change campaign also to appeal to students to use less energy. So the question is, okay, so you implemented both of those concurrently. How do you ascribe the benefit, or where do you ascribe the benefit of the work that you've done? Is the reduction in energy coming from the control systems that you've put in, or is it coming from the behavioural change that you're trying to engender within your population, within your clients? So that's an interesting kind of layering impact. And the same is true of, because very often energy saving impacts do layer up on each other. And the thing is, it's not just energy. This is a shower head. This is an Oxygenics low flow aerated shower head. I had responsibility for putting something like 18,000 of these into an estate. And what I would say is that there are some hard lessons to be learned around simple program management. With student accommodation, you have to be out the building by September. If you're doing summer works, you must be finished before September. Unfortunately, in some cases, some buildings, we made the mistake of allowing students to enjoy a 20 litre per minute shower for the first 2 or 3 weeks of term, and then we put in a 6 litre per hour shower head. Now, I've never had such interesting meetings in my life, but it's important to recognise that, you know, the use of water in a building is an important carbon emissions factor as well. I think at recent factors, it's 0.149 kilograms per metre cubed of water for raw water. And of course, that's also associated with, and it calculates your water treatment factor as well, which is even higher, 0.272 kilograms per metre cubed. So, you know, it can be a painful process in its implementation as well, and it's all about that planning piece. So bringing it all together then, this is an airport. This is Bristol Airport, and this is its carbon reduction plan. So I would argue that if an airport can do it, then most businesses should be able to do it. Even airports can pull together this plan. What I would say is that it's really important to follow the guidance that's set out in PAS 2060, because the way in which you communicate this it needs to be absolutely fastidious. You need to have the ability to justify and substantiate anything that you say within that plan, because the risk is huge. The risk to your brand is huge. And as of last year, the CMA has indicated that it will send directors to jail. So, you know, directors could go to jail for making misleading claims. If you're misleading the public, then you can face a prison sentence. I also would note the rather large leap of faith between 2030 and 2050. We're all going to be doing short-haul electric flights by then. I won't be first in the queue. And the other thing to say is that, you know, the plan should be subject to a regular review, and that is to keep pace with technology. I'm not saying this plan is wrong. I'm just saying that, you know, that you know, there are some bets in there around technology and the rate of development of technology that are kind of built in there. What's the contingency plan? You know, how is this business going to deal with things not developing quite as planned on this one? Okay, I've gone slightly over my time allocation now. I don't know whether I can bring Rob in at this stage, but Rob is going to be hopefully bringing some questions forward from the audience. Rob, how are we doing? Have we had any questions that we could perhaps tackle?
Yeah, definitely, David. Well, first of all, thank you very much again, David, for a really insightful journey through carbon reduction planning, and certainly for the shout out for me that the big picture, longer term strategy to the business, but then tying back to the day-to-day operational change that PAS 2060 enables you to make as a framework. So there's a few questions that we've had there coming in. I'll just punch through these fairly quickly with the time. First question here is, we mentioned the Energy Saving Trust suggest moving over to cloud storage, in their case with Microsoft Azure's, but don't cloud storage and servers use a lot of energy? And if so, is this actually a beneficial thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, Rob, we've had a number of conversations around this particular topic. If you read the Microsoft position paper on this, they are arguing that, yeah, cloud computing is a more efficient way of doing it. It is surfacing the evidence and surfacing the comparisons, etc., is extremely difficult. You know, so I would say it's horses for courses. Everyone needs to be thinking very carefully. Data centers obviously are power hungry. They've got huge cooling requirements. They've got which is why a lot of data centers appear in very cold climates to minimize the cooling load, etc. But data centers themselves are making use of technology in order to minimize that impact. We've seen, I've looked at several solar PV installations at scale to help data centers to decarbonize that electricity load. So I guess there's two things. One is the physical environment in which that data center is operating, and can that be made more efficient per se? And secondly, how is it that you as a cloud data services user get reassurance around the fair share, if you like, of your carbon emissions that result from that?
Yeah, it's just to add to that for the question that's been asked. I mean, we know from a number of current projects where that exact question's been asked about the move to the cloud as a measurable reduction, certainly within past 2060 criteria. And to date, despite extensive research, the conclusion we've had to draw is that because the way in which the data center or the cloud-based storage varies so much from every individual user, actually getting measured effective data from a cloud-based system is not possible at this stage. So whilst there is some really good work that's been done to measure the footprint of internal or known use data centers, large cloud-based setups like that, at the moment, we're finding hard to measure.
Yeah, we're finding it hard to put on authoritative measures. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, so the next question there is how credible are zero carbon electricity tariffs? Do any really allow you to report zero carbon emissions for your electrical use? So it's certification really of green energy.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the green tariff does have a value, I would say, but it's really important that you're discerning when you come to procure that tariff. You need to make sure that you're talking to a supplier who will also provide you with a REGO, a renewable energy guarantee of origin, in order to reassure yourself that that tariff is in fact low carbon or zero carbon. And the other thing I would say is that it's important also to make sure that you measure under PAS 2060, that you measure the impact that you have as if you were buying brown energy from the grid, so grid average electricity as well. Because what you'll have to do is to substantiate the decision. The decision is made to consciously move from brown energy at grid average energy intensity, which is whatever 0.2331 or something per kilograms per kilowatt hour today, and you've made a decision to consciously go and buy that green tariff, and then you can ascribe, you can say, okay, we've come from here and we've gone to there, this is why, and here's my evidence, the REGO that goes alongside that to help you substantiate that claim and that reduction.
Excellent, thank you. On a more practical level, what would be some of the more popular, reasonable projects that are being implemented in, say, the first year of a carbon reduction planning exercise? We recognise the long-term journey you've shown, the journey to net zero, but past 2060 measurement periods, often a 12-month cycle. What are some of the more practical examples you're seeing day to day, popular right now?
Yeah, well, the things that tend to appear in everyone's consciousness and everyone's planning really are around communication, around carbon literacy, around onboarding the message and developing the message. So it's one of those kind of, it's either investing in resources, so bringing skills into the organisation, whether that's contractually or as employees. And they're building capacity in that whole area, and then taking great care about developing a communication strategy is very often, you've got to start by saying, well, this is everyone's journey, top to bottom in an organisation. We always insist that you have a representative group which has agency from senior management. So you either have senior management in that group, or you have people who have got that agency directly from senior management to get on and do stuff inside the business. And they must be able to communicate effectively about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and the likely impacts that they're having. So that's without doubt, I guess the easiest and most accessible measure. We often recommend also having a pathfinder project, so perhaps a physical asset gets invested in, either infrastructure or something like solar PV, where essentially it's a totem pole. It's something which gives physical evidence to progress being made within the organisation that can have a valuable communication impact as well. So that's another thing. And then, as I said earlier, the technology, the rate of change in technology has been quite startling with the Internet of Things that we used to call it. The ways in which we can measure and communicate and aggregate and report energy or activities generally is greatly enhanced over the last half dozen years. So very often sort of monitoring and targeting software and sensors come into, particularly in the built environment, or when you're talking about specifying new build, etc. these are the sort of things that that are appearing in corporate planning now. But yeah, I mean, it really is very dependent on the sector and on the organisation itself and on the opportunity spotting that we do.
I understand. Well, look, thank you very, very much, David. We really are just coming up on time now, but I thought a brilliant insight there to the wider term, bigger term, and longer term importance of carbon reduction planning, but then very much bringing to life how the annual review through PAS 2060 brings it to the forefront and makes it practical in application for businesses and beneficial in terms of appealing to their customer markets. So thank you very much, David. A reminder to everybody that NQA will be forwarding out the link to the recording of this as soon as they've had a chance to render the video sometime in the next 24 hours. There will also be a link within that for those of you who wish to download a copy of the slides. Anyone who has already requested copies of the slides from the first session will also receive those anyway, so you don't need to register a second time. The third webinar in our series is on the 20th of May, and that's where we'll now begin to examine and look at carbon offset credits and how they work in your journey to becoming verified carbon neutral. But on behalf of NQA and on behalf of Auditel, I'd like to thank all of you for listening today. And David, again, thank you very much for a great insight. Goodbye.